He was one of the richest men in the world, a titan of industry whose name was synonymous with innovation and ruthless efficiency. But Arthur Vance's vast fortune could not purchase the one thing he craved: a single, coherent word from his son. After firing 7 of the country's most qualified nannies, his desperation had become a palpable entity, a ghost that haunted the cavernous, sterile halls of his marble-floored mansion. Each specialist, armed with degrees and glowing recommendations, had failed to penetrate the silent fortress that was 5-year-old Leo. They saw only the diagnosis: severe, nonverbal autism, complicated by a congenital paralysis that had left him motionless since birth. They followed protocols, administered medications, and spoke to him in condescending tones, all of them eventually broken by the profound, unnerving stillness of the boy. But then a woman named Ilara showed up. She had no Ivy League credentials, only a quiet sorrow in her eyes that seemed to mirror the home's own grief, and a past steeped in a pain he couldn't yet fathom. She didn't try to make Leo talk. She didn't try to make him move. She simply sat with him, a silent sentinel of empathy, and one day Arthur returned home early, a rare break in his relentless schedule, to a site in the sun-drenched solarium that completely froze him in place. It was a moment so small, so earth-shattering in its simplicity, that it would not only shatter his understanding of his son, but break him completely, forcing him to rebuild his entire world from the ashes of a devastating lie. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. The Vance estate was less a home than a monument to absence. It sprawled across acres of manicured land, a cold architectural marvel of glass and steel that seemed designed to amplify silence. For Ilara, stepping through the towering front doors was like entering a mausoleum. The air was chilled, recycled, and carried no scent of life, no baking bread, no blooming flowers, just the faint antiseptic smell of industrial-grade cleaner. Her footsteps echoed on the polished obsidian floors as the butler, a stiff man named Hemlock, whose posture was as rigid as his title, led her through galleries of abstract art and rooms furnished with pieces that looked more like sculptures than places to sit. Everything was white, gray, or black. It was a world drained of color, a perfect reflection of the man who owned it. Arthur Vance interviewed her in his study, a room that overlooked a slate-gray reflecting pool. He didn't rise from his vast mahogany desk. He was a man carved from the same stone as his house, sharp angles, a formidable presence, and eyes that assessed her with the detached scrutiny of a CEO reviewing a quarterly report. He scanned her thin resume, his finger tapping a rhythm of impatience. "You have no formal training in special needs care, Ms. Davies," he stated, his voice a low baritone that tolerated no argument. 7 women, all with doctorates in pediatric neurology and developmental psychology, have failed. What precisely do you believe you can offer? Ilara met his gaze without flinching. Her own past was a ghost that walked beside her, a constant, aching presence. The loss of her own son, Samuel, at the age of 3 to a swift and brutal illness the doctors had misdiagnosed until it was too late, had hollowed her out, but it had also filled her with a unique, painful wisdom. She knew the language of silence. She understood the particular agony of a parent, helpless before a child's suffering. "I can offer patience, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I can offer my time. I will not try to fix your son. I will simply be with him." It was the wrong answer, she knew. He wanted action, results, a measurable return on his investment. But her words, spoken with an unnerving sincerity, seemed to bypass his logic and strike a deeper, more resonant chord of despair. He saw the faint dark circles under her eyes, the history of grief etched into the lines around her mouth. He saw a fellow survivor. He hired her on the spot, not with hope, but with the weary resignation of a man who had exhausted all other options. Her first meeting with Leo was in his room, a space that was more like a hospital suite than a child's bedroom. The walls were a sterile white. A heart monitor beeped in a soft, monotonous rhythm. Medical charts were clipped to a board at the foot of his modified bed, and in the center of it all was Leo. He was a beautiful child with his father's dark, serious eyes and a cascade of soft brown curls that had belonged to his mother. He was propped up by a series of orthopedic pillows, his small body utterly still. His eyes stared blankly at the ceiling, unblinking, unfocused. In his left hand, his fingers were curled tightly around a small, worn wooden horse, its paint chipped from years of silent companionship. The departing nurse, a stern woman with a clipboard, gave Ilara a curt, pitying look. His medication is administered at 8, 12, 4, and 8. It's a muscle relaxant and a sedative. Keeps him comfortable. Dr. Finch's orders are absolute. Don't deviate. He doesn't respond to stimuli. Don't expect him to. Ilara nodded, waiting for the woman to leave. When the door clicked shut, the silence in the room deepened. The only sounds were the beep of the monitor and the whisper of the air filtration system. She pulled a simple wooden chair to his bedside, ignoring the array of brightly colored, neurologically approved sensory toys that lay untouched in a sterile plastic bin. She didn't speak. She didn't touch him. She just sat, breathing in sync with the quiet rhythm of the room, letting her presence be a gentle, undemanding fact. For hours she watched him. She saw the minute rise and fall of his chest, the faint, almost imperceptible flutter of his eyelids, the way his fingers were clenched around the wooden horse, a grip that seemed less like a spasm and more like a deliberate protective hold. The nurse had said he was unresponsive, a living doll, but Ilara, a connoisseur of sorrow, saw something else. She saw a flicker. It was deep within his eyes, a brief, transient spark of light that appeared and vanished in an instant. It wasn't a reflection from the window. It was something from within, a ghost of a thought, a distant echo of the boy trapped inside. Later that afternoon, as the sun streamed through the sanitized, triple-paned glass, a bird landed on the windowsill outside. It was a small, vibrant blue jay, and it let out a sharp, cheerful cry. Ilara's eyes were on Leo's face. For a single breathtaking second, his own eyes shifted, a minuscule, almost invisible movement towards the sound. It was gone as quickly as it came, his gaze returning to its vacant stare at the ceiling. But she had seen it. It wasn't a reflex. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was a reaction. The reports, the doctors, the 7 failed nannies, they were all wrong. Leo wasn't an empty vessel. He was a prisoner, and Ilara, with nothing left to lose, had just found the keyhole. The inciting incident was not a grand revelation, but a whisper, a promise of a soul waiting to be found in the suffocating silence. The days that followed settled into a quiet routine, a stark contrast to the frantic, protocol-driven schedules of her predecessors. Ilara understood that Leo's world was one of overwhelming, chaotic sensory input that his mind and body, trapped in their strange stasis, could not process. The other nannies had tried to bombard him with stimulation, flashing lights, textured objects, loud, cheerful voices, believing they could force a response. Ilara did the opposite. She began to peel back the layers of noise, creating a sanctuary of calm. Her first act was to challenge the room itself. With a quiet determination that brooked no argument from the household staff, who were accustomed to the rigid dictates of Mr. Vance and Dr. Finch, she began to make small, deliberate changes. She drew back the heavy blackout curtains, allowing the natural, shifting light of the day to fill the room instead of the constant, humming glare of the overhead fluorescent bulbs. She noticed how Leo's pupils would contract slightly in the morning sun, a tiny biological acknowledgement of the world outside. She turned off the beeping heart monitor, whose rhythmic pulse she felt was more of an anxiety-inducing metronome than a comfort. She would check his pulse herself, her warm fingers on his small wrist, a human connection instead of a digital one. She spoke to him constantly, but not in the high-pitched, simplistic tone the others had used. She spoke to him as an equal. She sat by his bed and read aloud, not from children's books, but from novels she herself enjoyed, her voice a low, steady murmur. She read chapters from The Old Man and the Sea, describing the deep blue of the water and the powerful pull of the great marlin. She read poetry, letting the rhythm of the words wash over him. She told him about her day, about the grumpy chef in the kitchen, about the deer she saw on the lawn that morning. She asked him questions and then answered them herself, creating a one-sided conversation that filled the sterile silence with the cadence of human interaction. Her primary experiment, however, centered on touch and scent. The medical staff always wore latex gloves, their touch clinical and impersonal. Ilara never did. Her hands were warm and soft. She would gently massage his limbs, which were often stiff from disuse. She didn't use the prescribed vigorous motions of a physical therapist. Her touch was gentle, a slow, patient kneading of his muscles. She spoke to him as she did it, telling him which part of his body she was touching. "This is your hand, Leo. It has 5 fingers. They are curled up right now, holding your horse so tightly." She would bring things from the outside world for him to smell. A freshly cut rose from the garden, a sprig of rosemary, a damp handful of earth after a rainstorm. She would hold them just under his nose, watching his nostrils for the slightest flare, another sign of the boy beneath the paralysis. Arthur Vance remained a distant, formidable presence. He received daily reports from Hemlock and the head nurse, concise summaries of Leo's stable, unchanging condition. They mentioned Ilara's unorthodox methods with a hint of disapproval, the open curtains, the lack of electronic monitoring, but since Leo's vital signs remained constant, Arthur saw no reason to intervene. He was a man who dealt in data, and the data showed no change. He saw her quiet presence as a benign failure, preferable to the noisy, frustrating failures of the others. He would occasionally watch her on the security cameras, seeing her sit for hours by Leo's bed, reading, or simply being silent. He dismissed it as wasted effort, a gentle soul tilting at the windmills of an incurable tragedy. But Ilara was gathering her own data. She kept a small, private journal noting every minute reaction. 10:14 a.m. Eyelid fluttered in response to a passage from a book about birds. 2:30 p.m. A slight tensing in his jaw when the vacuum cleaner started in the hallway. 4:05 p.m. His grip on the wooden horse tightened when she began to sing a soft lullaby. These were her data points, the evidence of a mind that was listening, feeling, and reacting, even if his body could not obey his commands. Her suspicions about his medication began to grow. She noticed a pattern. In the hour or so before his next scheduled dose, these flickers of response would become more frequent, more pronounced. The fog seemed to lift from his eyes just slightly, revealing a glimmer of awareness. Then, within 20 minutes of the nurse administering the liquid medicine via his feeding tube, the fog would roll back in, thick and impenetrable. His muscles would go slack, and the profound stillness would return. She began to test this hypothesis. One afternoon, knowing the nurse was due at 4, Ilara sat close to Leo's bed around 3:30. She brought with her a small bowl of warm water infused with lavender. She dipped a cloth in the water and began to gently wash his face. As she wiped his brow, she hummed the same lullaby she had sung before. It was a simple, mournful tune she had once sung to Samuel. "This was my little boy's favorite song," she whispered, her voice thick with memory. "His name was Samuel. He would have loved to have been your friend." She watched his face, her heart aching with a mixture of hope and sorrow. And then it happened. A single tear escaped from the corner of his right eye and traced a slow, silent path down his temple. It was not a product of dry eyes or a reflex. It was a response, an expression of an emotion he could not voice. At that moment the door opened, and the 4 o'clock nurse entered with a small measured cup of medicine. Ilara gently wiped the tear away, her secret now a burning certainty in her chest. The medicine wasn't just keeping him comfortable. It was imprisoning him. It was the bars on his cage. Her quiet observation had given way to a dangerous, radical theory, and she knew, with a chilling sense of purpose, that she was the only one who could prove it. The breakthrough, when it came, was not a thunderclap, but a whisper in the quietest room of the house. It was born from a memory, a piece of Ilara's own shattered past that she decided to share with the silent boy. 3 weeks into her tenure, she had grown bold in her quiet experiments. She knew the rhythm of the house, the precise timing of the staff's movements, the brief windows of opportunity when she and Leo were truly alone. She had confirmed her theory about the medication cycle. Leo's moments of greatest clarity, his most discernible reactions, always occurred in the 30 to 45 minutes before his next dose. The medicine was a chemical blanket, and she had discovered the moments when it wore thin. One Tuesday afternoon, during that precious pre-dose window, she brought a small, tattered box into his room. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a simple wooden bird, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. It was crudely carved, the work of an amateur, but it was smooth from years of being held. "This was Samuel's," she said softly, her voice catching. "My Samuel. His grandfather carved it for him. He called it his freedom bird. He believed it could fly him away anywhere he wanted to go in his dreams." She took the bird from the box and held it in her palm. The memory was sharp, painful. Samuel in his hospital bed, his small body racked with fever, clutching this same bird. She had almost not brought it. The pain was too immense. But her intuition, the same force that had guided her since she first walked into this house of grief, told her this was important. She moved closer to Leo, whose eyes held that familiar pre-dose glimmer of lucidity. "I'm going to put this in your hand, Leo," she said, her voice a gentle current. "Just for a moment." His left hand was, as always, clenched around the small wooden horse, his totem of connection to a mother he'd never known. His right hand lay open on the blanket, palm up, the fingers slightly curled. The doctors had said it was a position of flaccid paralysis. Ilara believed it was a hand waiting for a purpose. Slowly, carefully, she placed the wooden bird into his open palm. She expected nothing. It was a symbolic gesture, a sharing of her own loss with a boy trapped in his own. For a long moment nothing happened. The room was still, the only sound the distant hum of a lawnmower on the vast estate grounds. Ilara watched his face, her breath held tight in her chest. Then she saw it, a tremor. It started in his thumb, a tiny, barely perceptible twitch. It was a flicker of neurological fire in a long, dormant limb. The tremor traveled to his index finger, then the next. One by one, as if waking from a long and terrible sleep, his fingers began to curl around the smooth, carved wood of the bird. It was not a spasm. It was a deliberate, agonizingly slow movement of intention. His fingers, which the world's best doctors had declared useless, closed around the bird, securing it in a gentle, definite grip. Ilara let out a gasp, a sound halfway between a sob and a cry of triumph. Her eyes filled with tears, blurring the image of the small hand holding the bird. She looked from his hand to his face. His eyes were no longer vacant. They were fixed on her, and for the first time she saw not a void, but a presence. There was a depth and awareness, a flicker of a soul looking out from its prison. And then he made a sound. It was not a word, not a cry. It was a soft, guttural exhalation of air, a tiny noise of effort and acknowledgement. It was everything. It was the first stone cast against the glass wall of his silence. It was proof. It was hope, fragile and fierce and terrifyingly real. Ilara fell to her knees by his bedside, her head bowed, and she wept. She wept for the years this boy had lost, for the prison he had endured. She wept for her own Samuel, for the crushing weight of her own grief that had, in this moment, found a purpose. She stayed there, her hand resting gently on Leo's arm, until the nurse came in for the 4 o'clock dose. Ilara rose quickly, composing herself, her face a mask of calm. She gently removed the wooden bird from Leo's grasp before the nurse could see it, his fingers releasing it with a slowness that was almost imperceptible. She placed it back in its box, a sacred relic now. As the nurse administered the familiar, cloudy liquid, Ilara watched as the light in Leo's eyes dimmed once more, as the life in his hand receded, the chemical blanket settling back over him. But she was not discouraged. The secret was out, shared between her and the boy. The hope she now harbored was no longer fragile. It was a fire, and she would protect it with everything she had. She knew a confrontation with Arthur Vance was inevitable. She could no longer hide her discoveries. The path forward would be fraught with conflict, but for the first time in a very long time, Ilara Davies felt the unshakable conviction of a battle she was destined to win. The collision course between Ilara's quiet revolution and Arthur Vance's rigid, grief-stricken control was set. Arthur, a man who managed his empire through a constant stream of data from a dozen screens, had also applied this method to his son. He reviewed the security footage from Leo's room every night, a painful ritual of searching for a miracle in the monotonous data stream. He would fast forward through the long, still hours, his thumb hovering over the controls, a flicker of hope always dying in the face of unchanging reality. But for the past few weeks, he'd noticed a change in the routine. He saw Ilara with her books, her gentle massages, the open curtains. He had dismissed it all as harmless, sentimental nonsense. One evening, however, he didn't fast forward. A grueling day of negotiations had left him raw and exhausted, and he found himself watching the day's recording in real time, a glass of scotch in his hand. He watched as Ilara entered with the small wooden box. He leaned closer to the monitor, his brow furrowing. He saw her place the carved bird in Leo's hand. He watched, his breath catching in his throat, as his son's fingers he had been told by the world's leading pediatric neurologist would never move again, curled around the object. He saw the tremor, the intention. He saw Ilara fall to her knees. He rewound the footage, his hand shaking. He watched it again. And again, the evidence was irrefutable, a crack in the very foundation of his reality. His first reaction was not joy, but a cold, surging anger. It was an anger born of fear and helplessness. This woman, this unqualified, gentle woman, had defied the explicit orders of a medical authority. She had performed an unsanctioned experiment on his vulnerable son. What if she had hurt him? What if this was some cruel neurological anomaly that she had provoked, giving them a false and devastating hope? He stormed out of his study, his footsteps echoing like thunderclaps in the silent mansion. He found Ilara in the kitchen, quietly sipping a cup of tea, her shift long over. The staff scattered at the sight of his face, a thunderous mask of fury. "What have you been doing?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. He slammed a tablet down on the steel countertop, the security footage playing on a loop, Leo's hand closing over and over. Ilara looked at the screen, then back at him. Her expression was not one of fear, but of weary resolve. She had been waiting for this moment. "I have been getting to know your son, Mr. Vance," she said calmly. "You have been violating the doctor's protocols. Dr. Finch's instructions were clear. No unauthorized stimulus. You could have caused a seizure. You could have—" He trailed off, the words failing him. "Or I could have given him a reason to move," she countered, her voice gaining strength. "Your son is not who they told you he is. He is in there, Mr. Vance. He is listening. The medication they give him is suppressing him, burying him under layers of chemical sedation. That medication keeps him from being in pain. It manages his condition," Arthur shot back, parroting the words doctor Finch had repeated to him for 5 years. "Does it?" Elora stood up, her quiet demeanor a stark contrast to his raging energy. "Or does it just make his condition easier for everyone else to manage? I have watched him. In the hour before each dose, he is more present. He hears. He feels. Today, he moved. He chose to move. He held a gift I gave him." Arthur stared at her, his mind a battlefield of conflicting emotions. For 5 years, he had clung to the diagnosis like a raft in a storm. It was a terrible, painful certainty, but it was a certainty nonetheless. It gave him a framework, a set of rules to follow. Elora was asking him to let go of that raft and plunge into the terrifying, unknown waters of hope. To believe her was to admit that for 5 years he had been complicit in his son's imprisonment. The guilt was a physical blow. His anger deflated, replaced by a raw, aching vulnerability. "How?" he whispered, the single word a plea. "I don't know how," she admitted. "But I know what I saw. I believe the paralysis isn't congenital. I believe it's chemical. And I believe if we can find a way to safely wean him off the sedatives, you will see your son again." At that moment, as if summoned by the sheer emotional weight of the conversation, the head nurse appeared at the kitchen entrance, her face pale. "Mr. Vance, sir, it's Leo. He's agitated. His heart rate is elevated. He seems distressed." Arthur and Elora rushed to the boy's room. Leo was thrashing his head slightly against his pillows, a low, frustrated moan escaping his lips, a sound he had never made before. The nurse was preparing a syringe with an extra dose of the sedative. Dr. Finch said if he ever shows signs of distress, to administer this immediately. "No," Arthur commanded, the word cracking like a whip. He looked from his distressed son to the syringe, then to Elora's pleading eyes. The choice was laid bare before him. The old way, the path of sedation and certainty, or this new, terrifying path of faith. He saw the loop on the tablet in his mind's eye, the small hand closing. He stepped in front of the nurse, blocking her path to his son. "Put it away." He then turned to Elora, his eyes shining with unshed tears. The alliance was forged not with a handshake, but with a shared look of desperate hope over their son's bed. "What do we do?" he asked her, no longer the employer to his employee, but a father to his partner. "We sit with him," Elora said, her voice a balm. "We let him know he's not alone." She moved to the bedside, taking Leo's hand, the one that had held the bird, in hers. Arthur, his heart pounding with a feeling he hadn't felt since his wife's death, hesitantly took the other. Together, they formed a new, fragile trinity, united against the long, dark night of lies that had enveloped their lives. With the battle lines drawn, Arthur Vance pivoted from grieving father to formidable strategist. The cold, analytical mind that had built a global tech empire was now focused on a single objective: uncovering the truth about his son. The mansion, once a sterile monument to his sorrow, transformed into a command center. His first act was to dismiss the entire nursing staff on paid leave, citing a need for privacy. He then contacted his personal physician, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Dr. Lena Hansen, whom he trusted implicitly, and flew her in on his private jet. Elora became the center of this new operation. She was no longer just the nanny. She was the primary witness, the keeper of the crucial data that existed outside of medical charts. Arthur set her up in his study, the room where he had once interviewed her with such dismissive authority. He asked her to recount every detail, every observation, every flicker of response she had catalogued in her journal. He listened with an intensity that was both unnerving and validating, typing her anecdotal evidence into a secure file, creating a timeline that juxtaposed her observations against Leo's medication schedule. A clear, damning pattern emerged. "Every single significant response you've noted," Arthur murmured, staring at the screen, "occurred within 60 minutes of a scheduled dose. His moments of clarity are a countdown to being sedated again." Dr. Hansen arrived that evening. She was a woman in her 50s, with shrewd, intelligent eyes and a demeanor that radiated competence. She listened to Ilara's story and reviewed Arthur's timeline without a flicker of skepticism. Then she asked for Leo's complete medical history. Arthur unlocked a safe in his study and produced a stack of binders, each one filled with years of reports, test results, and prescriptions, all signed by one man, Dr. Alistair Finch. For hours, the three of them sat around the vast mahogany desk, the room illuminated by a single lamp, poring over the dense documents. Ilara, with no medical training, felt out of her depth, yet her intuition guided her. She pointed to things that felt wrong, even if she didn't have the vocabulary to explain why. "This drug," she said, her finger tracing a line on a prescription record from the week of Leo's birth. "Zetadone. It's the first one he was given, and he's still on it." Dr. Hansen's eyes narrowed. She pulled out her laptop and began typing furiously. "Zetadone is a powerful benzodiazepine derivative," she said after a moment, her voice tight. "It's used as a short-term muscle relaxant and sedative, typically post-surgery or for acute seizures. It's not intended for long-term use, especially in a developing child. The side effects of prolonged exposure can include severe muscle atrophy, cognitive impairment, and a state of induced paralysis." The room went silent. The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Induced paralysis. "Alistair, Dr. Finch, he told me it was necessary," Arthur said, his voice hoarse. "He said Leo was born with a rare neurological disorder, that his muscles were in a constant state of spasticity, causing him immense pain. He said this was the only thing that kept him comfortable." "Is there any record of this spasticity?" Dr. Hansen asked, her tone clinical and sharp. "Any EEG, any MRI that confirms this initial diagnosis?" They searched through the files. They found dozens of follow-up reports from Dr. Finch, all describing Leo's stable, paralyzed state. They found consultations with specialists whom Finch had recommended, all of whom seemed to confirm Finch's findings. But the initial diagnostic proof, the foundational evidence for 5 years of intensive medication, was missing. There was only Dr. Finch's handwritten note from the day of Leo's birth, describing a traumatic delivery resulting in severe perinatal hypoxia and subsequent spastic quadriplegia. Ilara's attention was drawn to another file, a thin manila folder tucked away at the very back of the drawer. It was labeled Eleanor Vance, Arthur's late wife. His hand trembled as he passed it to Dr. Hansen. Inside was the coroner's report: death by amniotic fluid embolism, a rare and tragic complication of childbirth. But underneath it was something else, a small, leather-bound journal. "Her diary," Arthur whispered, his face ashen. With a sense of trespassing on sacred ground, Ilara gently opened it. Eleanor's handwriting was elegant, looping script. The last few entries were filled with the joyful anticipation of motherhood. The final entry, dated the morning she went into labor, was a scrawl, written in haste. "Contractions are strong. Alistair is here. He seems nervous. He dropped the fetal heart monitor, said the battery was dead. Arthur is on his way. I can't wait for them to meet. My beautiful boy." He dropped the fetal heart monitor. The words seemed to leap off the page. Dr. Hansen looked up, her face grim. "A dropped monitor, a dead battery. That's a classic excuse for a period of unmonitored fetal distress. If the baby's heart rate dropped and he missed it, that could cause hypoxia, brain damage, cerebral palsy. The pieces of the puzzle began to slam into place with sickening force. He made a mistake, Arthur said, the realization dawning on him with cold, horrifying clarity. During the birth, he injured Leo and my wife. Her death, was it really an embolism? Or was it a catastrophic error he needed to cover up, Dr. Hansen finished. If he caused a birth injury that led to Eleanor's death and Leo's condition, a diagnosis of a rare congenital disorder and a lifetime of sedatives would be the perfect way to hide it. No one would ever question the paralysis if they believed the boy was born that way. He could manage the illness himself, control the narrative, and prevent any other doctors from ever discovering the truth. The motive was no longer a mystery. It wasn't greed. It was self-preservation. Dr. Alistair Finch, their trusted friend, the man who had been a pillar of support in Arthur's grief, had not been managing a tragedy. He had been curating a lie to cover up a homicide. The artifact they had discovered, a dead wife's final words, had finally given a voice to a crime that had been silenced for 5 long years. The weight of the revelation settled over the room, a suffocating blanket of betrayal. For Arthur, the world had been rewritten. His grief for his wife was now tainted with the poison of murder. His sorrow for his son was now ignited with the fire of righteous fury. Dr. Alistair Finch had not just delivered his son, he had condemned him to a living death and stolen the love of his life. The central truth, now exposed in the lamplight of the study, was more monstrous than any of them could have imagined. The diagnosis was a lie. The paralysis was a symptom of the cure. The trusted family doctor was a killer. Arthur looked at Alara, whose intuition had started this avalanche, and then at Dr. Hansen, whose medical knowledge had given it a name. He was no longer just a father seeking to heal his son. He was a man seeking justice for his wife. He won't get away with this, Arthur vowed, his voice a low, chilling whisper that promised retribution. I'll dismantle his life, piece by piece. Dr. Hansen put a calming hand on his arm. First things first, Arthur. We need to get Leo off this medication. Safely. We'll set up a detox protocol here. We need to do it carefully, monitor him around the clock, and we need irrefutable proof. We need to document his recovery as the drug leaves his system. That will be our living evidence. Alara, who had been silent throughout the horrific discovery, finally spoke, her voice filled with a fierce, protective urgency. What will happen when he wakes up? He'll be in a world he doesn't know, in a body he can't control. He'll be terrified. Arthur looked at her, his eyes filled with a new, profound respect. In his rage, he had been thinking of revenge. She, as always, was thinking of the boy. You'll be there with him, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You won't leave his side. You are the only one he trusts. The plan was set. Dr. Hansen would manage the medical side, meticulously documenting every step of Leo's withdrawal. Arthur would begin the legal and investigative assault, hiring a team of the best private investigators in the country to dig into every aspect of Dr. Finch's life. And Alara would be Leo's anchor, his guide back to the world. The first step was to create a pretext for cutting off Dr. Finch. Arthur called him the next morning, his voice a carefully controlled mask of concern. Alistair, he said, Leo had a bad night, some sort of distress. I've had Dr. Hansen fly in for a second opinion. We're going to be running some new tests, and she wants to take him off all non-essential medications to get a new baseline. We'll be in touch. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line, and Arthur could almost hear the gears of panic turning in Finch's mind. Arthur, that's highly inadvisable, Finch said, his voice oozing with false concern. Leo's system is delicate. Removing the Zetadone could trigger the very spasticity it's meant to control. It could be incredibly painful for him. We'll take that risk, Arthur said, his voice like ice. and hung up the phone. The war had begun. For the next 48 hours, Leo's room became an intensive care unit. Dr. Hansen oversaw the gradual reduction of the zetadone, while Ilara stayed by his side, speaking to him, singing to him, her presence a constant, reassuring warmth. The first day was difficult. As the drug began to leave his system, Leo's body, unused to sensation, reacted with tremors. His heart rate fluctuated. He moaned in his sleep. It was the agony of a body waking up, and it was torture for Arthur to watch. He had to physically restrain himself from ordering Dr. Hansen to administer the drug again, to end the apparent suffering. "This is what healing looks like, Arthur," Dr. Hansen told him firmly. "His nervous system is firing up for the first time in 5 years. It's a storm, but we have to ride it out." Ilara was his rock. She never left the boy, bathing his forehead with a cool cloth, whispering endless words of encouragement. "It's okay, Leo. You're just waking up. We're right here. You're safe." By the third day, the storm began to pass. The tremors subsided. Leo's breathing evened out, and the light in his eyes, it was no longer a flicker. It was a steady, curious gleam. He could follow Ilara with his gaze as she moved around the room. The fog was gone. Then the counterattack came. It was swift and brutal. Arthur was served with a court order. Dr. Finch, moving with the speed of a desperate man, had filed an emergency petition with Child Protective Services. The petition alleged that Arthur Vance, an emotionally unstable and grieving single father, had fallen under the influence of an unqualified and dangerous caregiver, Ilara Davies. It claimed they had recklessly ceased critical, life-sustaining medication, thereby endangering the child. The order granted Dr. Finch, as Leo's primary physician of 5 years, temporary medical authority, and demanded that Leo be immediately transported to a hospital for evaluation and to have his medication reinstated. The retaliation had begun, and its aim was devastatingly precise: to separate Ilara from Leo and to place the boy right back into the hands of his captor. The arrival of the paramedics and the CPS agent was a violation, an invasion of the sanctuary they had so carefully built. The agent, a stern-faced woman named Miss Albright, carried a clipboard like a shield and regarded them with suspicion. Dr. Finch was with them, his face a mask of sorrowful duty, a performance of Oscar-worthy caliber. "Arthur, thank God we got here in time," he said, striding into the room. "I was so worried. This woman," he gestured to Ilara with disdain, "has no idea the damage she could have caused." "Get out of my house, Alistair," Arthur growled, his body tensed like a cornered animal. "I'm afraid I can't do that," Finch said smoothly, holding up a copy of the court order. "I have a legal responsibility to my patient. Miss Albright, you can see the child is in distress." He pointed to Leo, whose heart rate had indeed spiked on the monitor at the sight of the strangers and the raised voices. Ilara stood between Finch and the bed, a silent, immovable guardian. "You will not touch him," she said, her voice low and filled with a protective fire that surprised everyone, including herself. Ms. Albright stepped forward. "Ms. Davies, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside. We have a court order. We're taking the child to Northgate Hospital for assessment." She then turned to Arthur. "Mr. Vance, we have serious allegations here. Until our investigation is complete, Ms. Davies is not to have any contact with your son." The words were a physical blow. They were being torn apart at the most critical moment. Arthur's lawyers were already fighting the order, but the legal system moved slowly. Finch had used his reputation and the system's bias towards established medical authority to outmaneuver them. As the paramedics moved forward with a gurney, Leo began to cry. It was a sound none of them had ever heard before. Not a moan of discomfort, but a true heart-wrenching sob of fear. His eyes were locked on Ilara, and his right hand, the one that had held the bird, twitched on the blanket, his fingers opening and closing, reaching for her. Please, Ilara begged Miss Albright, tears streaming down her face. Don't do this. You're terrifying him. He's just woken up. But the agent's face was set. He needs to be evaluated by a neutral party. They placed Leo on the gurney. As they wheeled him out of the room, his eyes never left Ilara. The terror and confusion in his gaze were like a knife in her heart. Dr. Finch followed them, pausing at the door to give Arthur a look of triumphant pity. "Don't worry, Arthur. I'll take good care of him. We'll get him stabilized." The moment the ambulance pulled away, a profound and terrible silence fell over the mansion once more. Leo was gone. Ilara was banished. The regression was immediate and devastating. Back in the sterile environment of the hospital, under Finch's direct control, Leo was immediately put back on the Zetadone, the light in his eyes extinguished. The nascent movements in his hand ceased. He retreated back into the silent prison from which he had only just begun to escape. The crisis was absolute. The antagonist had not only retaliated, he had won the first battle, reclaiming his victim and leaving Arthur and Ilara shattered, separated, and facing a legal machine that believed they were the villains. Arthur had all the money in the world, but in that moment he had never felt more powerless. The separation from Leo was a unique form of torture for both Arthur and Ilara. For Ilara, every ticking second was an agony, imagining Leo alone in a cold hospital room, the chemical fog once again descending upon him. For Arthur, the powerlessness was maddening. He was a man accustomed to bending the world to his will, yet he was barred by law from his own son's bedside, forced to trust the very man he now knew to be a monster. But despair was a luxury he could not afford. The rage he felt was a clean, cold fuel. He channeled it into action. While his legal team filed emergency appeals, Arthur unleashed his private investigators. He spared no expense, hiring a firm of ex-intelligence agents known for their ruthless efficiency. "I want to know everything about Alistair Finch," he told the lead investigator, a grim-faced man named Kincaid. "I want to know where he banks, who he talks to, what he eats for breakfast. I want every skeleton he's ever hidden. Find the leverage that will break him." Kincaid's team swarmed, a digital and physical ghost army. They delved into Finch's financials, his communications, his professional history. The first few days yielded nothing but the pristine record of a respected physician. Finch was clever. He had covered his tracks well. Meanwhile, Ilara, though banished from the estate, was not idle. She was their secret weapon, the keeper of the most crucial evidence. At Arthur's request, she checked into a secure hotel suite he had arranged, and there she began to write. She transcribed her entire journal, creating a detailed, day-by-day, hour-by-hour account of Leo's progress. She wrote with a novelist's attention to detail, describing the angle of the sun when his eyes first tracked a bird, the exact pitch of her voice when he first made a sound, the texture of the wooden bird that had elicited the first intentional movement. Her testimony was not a dry medical report. It was a powerful, emotional narrative of a boy's awakening. It was the human evidence that no medical jargon could refute. Arthur also brought Dr. Hansen into the war room he'd established in his home office. Together they worked on the medical counter-offensive. Dr. Hansen reached out to a network of the world's leading neurologists and toxicologists, sharing Leo's case history anonymously. The consensus was swift and damning. The long-term prescription of Zetadone for a child with Leo's supposed condition was not just unorthodox, it was gross malpractice. They prepared expert testimonies, affidavits that would dismantle Finch's medical credibility. The breakthrough from Kincaid's team came on the fourth day. It wasn't a financial smoking gun, but something far more personal. They had discovered that Dr. Finch had a gambling addiction, a severe one. For years, he had been losing heavily in high-stakes, underground poker games. He was in debt to some very dangerous people, to the tune of several $1,000,000. The timeline of his biggest losses coincided perfectly with key moments in Leo's life, specifically with consultations from expensive specialists Finch had brought in, specialists who had rubber-stamped his diagnosis and whose fees Arthur had paid without question. He wasn't just hiding a mistake, Arthur realized, the pieces clicking into place. He was monetizing it. He created a patient who required lifelong, expensive care and consultations, and he was getting kickbacks. He was using my son as his personal ATM. This new motive, desperate, sordid greed, was the lever they needed. It was proof of a pattern of deceit. But it still wasn't enough to overturn the court order on its own. They needed something more. They needed to prove definitively what happened on the day Leo was born. The key, they realized, was in Eleanor's diary. He dropped the fetal heart monitor. Kincaid's team tracked down every nurse who had been on duty in the maternity ward that day 5 years ago. Most remembered nothing. But one, a woman named Maria Flores, who had since retired and moved to a small town upstate, had a story to tell. Arthur and Alara flew to meet her. They found her in a small, tidy house with a garden full of roses. She was nervous, her hands trembling, as she poured them tea. "I was just an aide," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "But I remember that day. Mrs. Vance was so beautiful, and Dr. Finch, he was frantic. He was yelling at everyone. He did drop the monitor, but the battery wasn't dead. I saw him take them out." Alara leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "He took the batteries out of the back and put them in his pocket," Maria said, her eyes wide with the memory. "Then he yelled that the machine was broken. There was a period, maybe 10, 15 minutes, before they got another one, where there was no monitoring. When they finally got her hooked up again, the baby's heart rate was dangerously low. He ordered an emergency C-section. He wouldn't let anyone else in the OR but his own team. And it was the final crucial piece of evidence. A direct witness to the deliberate act of sabotage that had caused Leo's injury. Finch hadn't just made a mistake. He had engineered a cover-up in real time. Armed with Maria's sworn affidavit, Ilara's detailed testimony, the expert medical opinions, and the evidence of Finch's financial motive, Arthur's lawyers filed a motion for an emergency hearing. They didn't just request the order be overturned, they requested an independent medical evaluation of Leo by a court-appointed team at a neutral facility. And they filed a criminal complaint against Dr. Finch for medical malpractice, fraud, and reckless endangerment. The confrontation was set for a sterile courtroom. Dr. Finch arrived with his lawyer, looking confident and composed, the picture of a wronged physician. But as Arthur's lawyer began to lay out the evidence, piece by damning piece, the color drained from his face. He paled at the mention of his gambling debts. He flinched when Maria Flores was called to the stand. But it was Ilara's testimony that broke him. She didn't speak in legal or medical terms. She spoke of the boy. She described the light in his eyes, the feel of his fingers closing around the wooden bird. She projected the security footage on a large screen for the judge to see. The undeniable, intentional movement of a child declared hopelessly paralyzed. She ended by looking directly at the judge, her voice clear and strong. "For 5 years, that little boy has been locked inside himself. Dr. Finch didn't just fail to find the key, he built the prison, and he sold tickets to watch the tragedy. All I did was listen at the door, and I heard him. He is in there, and he deserves to be free." The judge, a woman known for her stern demeanor, was visibly moved. She looked from Ilara's impassioned face to Finch's crumbling composure. She granted the motion immediately. Leo was to be transferred to the care of a court-appointed medical team at University Hospital. Ilara's visitation rights were fully restored. The criminal investigation into Dr. Finch was to begin at once. Arthur and Ilara left the courthouse, and went directly to Northgate Hospital. They walked into Leo's room, armed with the new court order. Dr. Finch was there, frantically checking charts, his facade of calm shattered. When he saw them, he visibly recoiled. "You have no right," he stammered. Arthur handed him the papers. "It's over, Alistair." As the new medical team arrived to prepare Leo for transport, Ilara walked to his bedside. He was groggy from the renewed sedation, but as she took his hand, his eyelids fluttered. He knew she was there. "I'm here, Leo," she whispered, her tears falling onto his hand. "I'm not leaving you again." The final battle had been won. The long war for Leo's freedom was about to enter its final hopeful chapter. The transfer to University Hospital marked the true beginning of Leo's liberation. The court-appointed team, led by a renowned pediatric neurologist named Dr. Eris Thorne, immediately began a supervised, systematic withdrawal from the Zetadone. This time, there were no panicked phone calls to a compromised doctor, no threat of interruption. There was only science, patience, and hope. The climax of their struggle was not a single, explosive moment, but a series of quiet, breathtaking miracles that unfolded in the hushed, sunlit room of the pediatric wing. With Ilara a constant presence at his side, and Arthur a permanent fixture in a chair by the window, Leo began to emerge. The first few days were a repeat of the initial detox, but this time they were prepared. They soothed his tremors, managed his discomfort, and spoke to him in calm, reassuring tones, explaining every new sensation. The first vindication came on the 5th day. Dr. Thorne was conducting a neurological exam, testing Leo's reflexes. When he gently tapped the tendon below Leo's right knee, the leg kicked out. A simple, perfect reflex. "Doctor." Thorne looked up at Arthur, a slow smile spreading across his face. "There is absolutely nothing wrong with the neural pathways to his lower extremities. The signal is getting through." It was a small clinical observation, but for Arthur, it was a thunderclap. It was the first official medical confirmation that the diagnosis of congenital paralysis was a fraud. He looked at Ilara, his eyes shining, and she squeezed his hand, a shared moment of triumph. But the true emotional peak, the moment that shattered and remade them all, came 2 days later. Ilara had brought the small wooden bird. Leo had been off the Zetadone completely for 48 hours, and his eyes were clear, bright, and constantly moving, taking in the world with a voracious curiosity. Ilara sat on the edge of his bed and held the bird out to him, just as she had done in the mansion. "Look, Leo," she whispered, "it's your freedom bird." He looked at the bird, then at her face. His own face, so long a placid mask, contorted with effort. His brow furrowed, his lips pursed. He lifted his right arm off the bed. It was a shaky, clumsy movement, but it was his. He reached out, his small fingers stretching, and deliberately, consciously, took the bird from her hand. He held it, his gaze fixed upon it, a look of profound wonder on his face. And then he spoke. His first word was not Mama or Dada. It was a name. "Samuel," he whispered, the syllables clumsy and thick from years of disuse, but perfectly, miraculously clear. The sound struck Ilara with the force of a physical blow. She let out a choked sob, her hand flying to her mouth. He had heard her. All those weeks when she had spoken of her own lost son, he had been listening, absorbing, understanding. He had remembered the name. He was not just waking up. He was revealing the intelligent, empathetic, fully formed person who had been trapped inside all along. Arthur, who had been watching from his chair, fell to his knees, his composure finally breaking. The sound of his own son's voice, a sound he had believed he would never hear, broke through the final walls around his heart. He wept openly, without shame, for his wife, for his son's lost years, and for the incredible woman who had given them back to him. The news of Dr. Finch's downfall was swift and total. Faced with Maria Flores's testimony and the undeniable evidence of Leo's recovery, he confessed. The story became a media sensation. The celebrated doctor who had imprisoned a child to cover his crimes. His license was revoked and he faced a barrage of criminal charges, from medical malpractice and fraud to negligent homicide in the death of Eleanor Vance. His public disgrace was absolute. But for the three people in that hospital room, the outside world barely registered. Their world had shrunk to this sacred space of healing. Leo's progress became a daily cascade of wonders. He learned to control his limbs, first with jerky, uncoordinated movements, then with increasing grace. Physical therapists were brought in, and they were astonished at his rapid progress. He was a boy with 5 years of pent-up energy, 5 years of a desire to move and explore. Laura and Arthur became his guides. They were there for his first deliberate kick of a ball, his first time holding a crayon and making a joyous, colorful scribble. They were there when he first laughed, a sound so pure and beautiful it seemed to fill every corner of the sterile mansion they eventually returned to. Their reunion with the house was symbolic. Arthur had the staff strip Leo's room of all its medical equipment. They painted the walls a warm, sunny yellow and filled it with books and toys. The mansion itself began to change, the silence replaced by the sounds of a child's tentative exploration, the cold, sterile air filled with the scent of Elara's baking. One evening, weeks after they had returned home, Elara was putting Leo to bed. He was clutching the wooden bird in one hand and his mother's wooden horse in the other. "Elara," he said, his speech growing stronger every day, "sing." She smiled and began to sing the lullaby she had sung to Samuel, the mournful tune now transformed into a song of healing and love. As she sang, Leo reached up his free hand and gently touched her cheek. It was a gesture of such profound tenderness and gratitude that it took her breath away. Arthur stood in the doorway watching them. He saw not a nanny and her charge, but a mother and her son. He saw the woman who had not only saved Leo, but had saved him too, pulling him from the wreckage of his grief and showing him how to be a father. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his soul that his life of cold, calculated control was over. The vindication was not in Finch's arrest or the newspaper headlines. It was here, in this room, in the quiet bond between a rescued boy and his rescuer. It was the sound of a lullaby finally banishing the ghosts from the house. 2 years passed, a blur of healing and discovery. The Vance mansion was utterly transformed. The stark white walls were now adorned with Leo's vibrant, chaotic paintings. The silence was a distant memory, replaced by the sound of Leo's laughter echoing down the halls, the thud of a soccer ball against an outside wall, and the gentle melody of Elara's humming from the kitchen. The house was no longer a mausoleum, it was a home. Leo, now 7, was a whirlwind of energy and curiosity. The years of stillness had been replaced by a fierce desire to experience everything. He was enrolled in a small private school where he was thriving, his sharp, observant mind finally free to learn. While he was still quieter than other children, his silence was now one of thoughtful observation, not imprisonment. He had a particular love for astronomy, spending hours with Arthur and a large telescope on the veranda, his small finger pointing out constellations, his voice filled with wonder as he named distant galaxies. The doctors who examined him now were mystified. They saw a bright, healthy boy with no trace of the profound disabilities that had once defined his existence. Dr. Finch was serving a long prison sentence, his name a permanent cautionary tale in the medical community. Arthur, with Elara's guidance, had established the Eleanor Vance Foundation, a multi-billion-dollar organization dedicated to advocating for patients who were victims of medical malpractice and misdiagnosis. They funded independent review boards and provided legal aid to families who, like them, had been betrayed by a trusted authority. It was a legacy worthy of the woman whose death had been a catalyst for so much pain and now so much good. The relationship between Arthur and Alara had evolved organically, naturally, into something deep and profound. The lines between employer and employee, between friend and confidant, had long since blurred. She was his partner in every sense of the word. She helped him run the foundation, she co-parented Leo, and she filled the hollow spaces in his heart with a warmth and gentle strength he had never known. They were a family forged not by blood, but by a shared trauma and a triumphant, hard-won love. The culmination of their journey came on a warm spring evening. The foundation was holding its annual fundraising gala, a glittering affair held in a massive, transparent tent on the mansion's sprawling lawn. It was the first time Arthur had hosted a major social event since Eleanor's death. This time, it was not an obligation, but a celebration. Arthur stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of influential guests. He was no longer the cold, formidable titan of industry. His face was softer, the harsh lines of grief eased by years of happiness. He spoke of the foundation's work, of the families they had helped. Then his eyes found Alara and Leo standing in the front row. "None of this would be possible," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "without the courage of two people. My son, Leo, whose incredible strength and resilience is a daily inspiration." He smiled at Leo, who beamed back, a confident, happy child in a small tuxedo. "And the woman who saved us both." He looked directly at Alara. She was wearing a simple, elegant blue gown, her quiet grace a beacon in the glittering crowd. "Alara Davies came into our lives as a caregiver, but she taught me everything about what it means to care. She taught me to listen to the silenced, to trust in hope, and to fight for the truth. She is the heart of our family, and the heart of this foundation." He stepped down from the podium and walked to her, taking her hand. He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. In front of everyone, he knelt down on one knee. Gasps rippled through the crowd. "Alara," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "you have brought more light into my life than I ever thought possible. Will you marry me? Will you make our family official?" Tears streamed down Alara's face as she nodded, unable to speak. "Yes," she whispered, "yes." Arthur slid a beautiful, simple diamond ring onto her finger. Leo whooped with joy and threw his arms around both of them, his family complete and secure. The crowd erupted in applause, a wave of warmth and celebration for the happy ending they had so truly earned. Later that night, after the guests had departed, the three of them stood on the veranda looking up at the star-filled sky. Leo was nestled between them, his head resting on Alara's shoulder. It was a portrait of quiet joy, a family whole and at peace. True wealth, Arthur realized, wasn't in his bank accounts or his stock portfolio. It was in this moment, in the warmth of the woman he loved and the sound of his son's steady breathing. It was the understanding that sometimes the most profound truths aren't found in data or diagnoses, but are whispered in the quietest rooms, waiting for someone with enough patience and love to finally hear them. Before we go, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We'd love to know that.